Thank you very much. When we look at how India is doing, most of the times we compare ourselves with some of our neighboring countries, such as China or other Southeast Asian countries. And we have two views of India at the end of it. Some part of us is doing very well, and some part of us is not doing very well. And this has suggested that maybe there is something wrong with our institutions, and maybe some rearrangement should occur, and we are witness to many movements that are out there. What I want to bring to you today is the message, based on some of the work that I've been doing, is that the Indian democracy seems to be in good health, and there is a well-functioning democracy that is moving along with a self-correcting mechanism. So, the idea, maybe I can tell you with a little bit of an example as to what I mean by Indian society doing well. And for that I'll go to one of the well-known cases that unfolded in Delhi, which was to do with the pollution case. Delhi was very polluted. If you went to Delhi from, let's say, clean place, such as none other than Kozhikode, first thing that happens to you, you land and then you faint. Because you are not quite used to all those particles, all the smoke, all the heat. Now, there are many people who are running the buses. They are relatively rich. They are organized, whether you think of the bus organizations or the auto drivers and their organizations. They have those old engines emitting fumes, doing good for our citizens in whatever the way a smoke can do. Now one can imagine a story, if one talked about any change, it will go to the politicians to do something about it. And the politicians would say, listen, now we should do it, but it's going to cost you that much. How about you give me some money and then something and we'll reissue a press release, and that's what went on for several decades. No change. What we have at the end of it are special interests, politicians in league with each other, throwing the bureaucracy and a large amount of corruption with money changing hand, and citizens still suffering. What happens? A case is filed in court. That's the correcting mechanism of Indian democracy that begins to unfold around this time. The court says pollution must stop. You cannot use engines of the kind you do. You must move to something else, and that has to be done in a short time. And after several appeals and so forth, the court prevails. And as you go to Delhi now, it's still polluted, but it's certainly not as bad as it was in the olden times. So here is a mechanism whereby the court moves in and makes a correction. Well, one can ask a question. If the court did this, wouldn't the interests, the truckers and the bus drivers or the bus owners and the auto owners, wouldn't they run to the politicians, please pass a law in the parliament to undo the court decision? And they did. But the point is, and that's the heart of the story, the politicians, even if they wanted to bring about a change, namely undo the court decision, they could not. There may be a variety of reasons for this, but I want to highlight one. The politicians did not have a majority to undo the court decision. Now, if you think about the olden times when Mrs. Gandhi had a big parliamentary majority, she could have done anything. And as you can recall, the court wasn't very powerful those days. It is the arrival of the coalition governments when if one of the factions of the coalition government is happy with what the court has decreed, is going to say to its coalition partner, listen, I don't want this change. I don't want to undo the court decision. The court decision is something that I want, that is good for the country, and we are happy with it. So we will not let any change come about. The court's decision shall prevail. And that's the era of coalition government and the time for the judicial independence had arrived. So the point, if you think about it, the power of the court emanates from the division among politicians. The coalition governments mean divided polity, and that divided polity then is what empowers the court to make a decision. And so much so in this case, in the Indian Supreme Court, that it goes on to appoint itself. And my question to ask today is, how did it become independent? How did the Indian Supreme Court become independent? So here is the legal story. In the 1970s, as I said a moment ago, the court was weak, and it was further weakened by the emergency of Mrs. Indira Gandhi. Then, in the 80s and 90s, we have three cases. They are commonly known as the first judge's case, the second judge's case, and the third judge's case. In the first judge's case, which takes place in 1981, the decision is delivered in 1981, the court says the primacy in matters of appointment and transfer of judges is that of the executive branch and not of the judiciary. So the executive branch will decide, the president will sign, and that is that. We go to the second judge's case, October 93, and this time the court decrees that the Supreme Court has primacy in matters of all appointments and transfers. And in 1998, the third judge's case, the court decrees that all transfers and appointments and promotion cases will be taken up by a collegium of 5 judges consisting of the Supreme Court of India and 4 senior-most judges. And these 5 will make all decisions, and of course the President shall appoint, that the decision will eventually be binding on the President. So what you see here, if you look at the story as it unfolds from 80s to the 90s, is the power being taken away from the government and being now taken up, and is the province of the judicial system. But that's the legal story. Why did it happen the way it did? So the hypothesis is, if there is a majority that does not like the court decision and can mobilize itself to pass a law to undo the court decision, court will be less powerful. It would be powerful in the times of Mrs. Gandhi or Rajiv Gandhi. And the moment the coalition governments come in, the court shall prevail, in the sense that a court decision cannot be undone by the politicians even if they want to. So this is not the legal but the political economy story as to how it happened. And if you look at the numbers above, in 1971 through 84, the majority party has a thumping majority, let's call it that. There is no chance for a court. And so the 1981, the first judge's case in green color, tells you the court decision was a meek. The executive has the authority to appoint and transfer judges. And the age of coalition governments begins, the divided polity, and pretty soon, as the case was brewing, in 1993, the second judge's case. And 1998, the institutionalization of the second judge's case, namely the arrival of the collegium. And India had been under the framework of the coalition government. So as long as you believe that India will remain in the framework of the coalition government, we are going to have a judiciary that is very powerful. It's a judiciary that has, the key point to observe here among several that I have, one is the arrival of the judiciary. Secondly, the time it took for it to happen. From 1990, basically 93, or you might, if you want to be a little generous or more conservative, let's say 1990 or so. So in a window of 20 years, a transition that has occurred, which has made the court very powerful. Every day you look in the newspapers, you find the court has dictated this and dictated that. Indeed, here on 4th of July, the court created a new standing body to monitor corruption in the country and said one more thing which is more striking, namely, you, the executive branch, you have appointed a committee for this. That committee shall now be part of the court's appointed committee. Now, when you look at the Supreme Court attained its independence unilaterally. It's not because the politicians wanted it to become independent. It's because it became independent because it could do so and the politicians could not do anything else. It represents a relatively permanent change, at least I don't easily foresee arrival of a majority party quite in the near future. So it seems to me to be a relatively permanent change, a change that is embedded in the system and not in some strong judges with some weak politicians. It's a change that has happened in the system and is probably going to last. So let's take an example of it. If the court is really that powerful. So here is the Golden Jubilee celebration of the Supreme Court of India, which began on 26th of January 1950. And Prime Minister Vajpayee in the audience and the Chief Justice of India says, in this country, the prevailing system of administrative justice, including appointment judges, etc., is working well. It is a matter of pride and satisfaction that the judiciary today enjoys credibility that's far greater than that enjoyed by the other two wings of the state. I do not know how you read it. The way I read it, it's high insult to the Prime Minister, and the Prime Minister could do nothing about it because there was not much he could do. The court has now emerged as a body to be reckoned with, and this is the rise of checks and balances in the Indian polity. So we observe then the consolidation of democracy in India, which is taking place on many fronts with the rise of the middle class, and with the power sharing that is growing, establishment of elections, decentralization of power. But the institutional evolution of India is proceeding at a breakneck speed. 20 years. I would not find any country in the world, and I have given some examples when I look at the history of the USA, United Kingdom, ancient Rome, ancient Athens, as well as Europe. This is unprecedented. Something of this magnitude happening in a 20-year window is unprecedented. Indeed, I do not know of any court that self-appoints, where the self-appointment is the high point of the judicial independence. And if you look at even the American system, the courts are appointed by the politicians and then they are independent. But not so in the case of India, where they appoint themselves. And so that's a very unique feature of our system, where the Supreme Court of India is now enforcing various rules. It takes time. It takes 2, 3, 4 years, 5 years. It doesn't happen overnight when the court is able to say to the politician, you are not above the law. Find me any time in history of India when 2 or 3 well-known politicians are in prison for as long as they have been. The cases go to the court and the court denies them the opportunity to be released. You might disagree with that court decision in that particular case, but the fact remains that this is a judiciary here to stay and to enforce the rule of law on all. Nobody is going to be above the law, so it seems. There is one more feature of the Indian Supreme Court of the Indian judiciary. It's somewhat, I find it far more attractive, because the judges retire at 65 and there are 31 judges. When I compare with the USA, there are 9 judges over there and they will live for life. The American judiciary is highly politicized. You have a conservative judge who votes conservative all the time. They have a lifetime tenure which averages at about recently after 1970. The tenure of a judge on an average is 27 years. the tenure of a judge in India is 1.5 years on an average. It's a big difference of the Supreme Court. I'm just focused on the Supreme Court right now. So there is no reason in a large group which has a tenure of a short time to really come together to engage in some political machinations, much like the Americans can do and they are doing. As we know, in the year 2000, the election of the United States was delivered to George Bush by the Supreme Court. That doesn't happen here. So there is some remarkable feature, and so what I think that we have with us a Supreme Court rising at a great speed. Its effect is not steep, but it will, as I foresee, will be forthcoming. And if you look at the speed at which happened, what I think of this one is more like a hurricane. And what I think about the other story that is unfolding right now in India, the Lopa, is more like a tornado. That's the comparison. But the hurricane is already in place. It's going to be taking its shape, and we will be having a society more desirable, leading me to my conclusion at the outset that India is in good state. And so what I would think about is that let the court have a bit of time. It can do many things. And is it something we should really run for bringing about institutional changes right away just because it can be done? This is a well-tested method of setting up a democracy as per the Constitution, where the rules are well known and divided, polity, divided judiciary, checks and balances exist. Lastly, I would like to conclude with one comment. The collegium of the Supreme Court has come under strong criticism, and I share that sentiment, because there is a great concentration of power in the 5 judges of the Supreme Court. They should be more open, and I hope that the Supreme Court would agree to become more open, to make the appointing body to be limited not only to the Supreme Court, but will also cover some additional people. Members of the judiciary can be a majority in such a body, but right now there are kinds of things happening in the Supreme Court which does not befit the image of the Supreme Court by way of this, because of this concentration of power. And I personally would be reluctant to create another body that is going to have so much power that itself will become an issue for our country. Thank you very much.